Lane Online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.
So today we're going to talk about research, the role of research in treatment, research to practice. The word that I've given you before, praxis, not the Klingon moon, but where theory and practice meet and inform each other. The addictions treatment movement started out as a grassroots movement. And I will credit the 12-step community with starting that, even though there are recovery movements that predate the 12-step movement, like the Wellbriety movement with Handsome Lake in the 18th century. But most people aren't aware of innovations that happen within communities of color, which will be defined shortly in the framework that I'll be giving you. But when the 12-step movement is like a grassroots movement, and so what happens when the grassroots movement gets legitimized and becomes big business, so grassroots to silk suits, dollar signs intended, because what happens when the suits get hold of a technology and basically limit access and basically limit consideration to what they consider valid? What will change? What will happen in terms of treatment efficacy and other things like that? So one of the things that happens is that with a grassroots movement, you have peers helping peers. They're basically having level playing field, equal power relationship to professional, where the power relationship changes because of not only the structure, but what people have to know relative to the client. And then back to a peer-driven model, where theoretically we are certifying peer recovery support people, but those people are compensated at a lower level than the professionals. And so now one of the things that the field is moving to is, which we've actually always stated in terms of looking at, you have to get certified with your CADC and at least a bachelor's, which reflects what was happening in this state. But in order to do counseling and to be compensated for counseling, you need a master's degree. So now they're saying not just 4 years of school, 6 years of school, and that could create a barrier for folks, especially given that how college is being funded these days. So let us continue. So in addition to this website that basically www.tappartnership.org, and under the mental health frequently asked questions, you have this, the feds, of course, have alphabet soup. So there's EST, that's not Earhart Seminars training, if you were old enough to remember the 70s and the self-help movements, the human potential movement back in the 70s and 80s. ESTs, EBP, CDE, PBE, and CDE. So the question is asked, what is the difference between empirically supported treatments, ESTs, evidence-based treatments, EBTs, evidence-based practice, EBP, cultural adaptations, practice-based evidence, and community-defined evidence? So why would you want to know all that stuff? Well, I'll show you. So I don't really want this to be kind of like a dry lecture, but part of this has some political implications for us in our work. So ESTs, empirically supported treatments, and evidence-based treatments refer to empirically developed specific interventions that are based upon randomized controlled trials using a control group and an experimental group to prove their validity, reliability, and effectiveness in terms of how generalizable they can be. So taking each one of those in turn. So when they talk about, this is a scientific point of view, and how you do science and how you do research. And so, for example, when we say that alcohol has the idea about genetic predisposition. Okay, so where that came from was longitudinal. Okay, so that means 20 years. So basically a generation. Double blind. That meant the researchers didn't know, and the subjects didn't necessarily know either. Double blind, right? And then replicated studies. Okay, studio, we're getting the music. Cut it off here, if you would. So, replicated studies, essentially meaning, so with the alcohol genetic predisposition, we had, these were the Scandinavian twin studies. So first they replicated among males, and then they replicated among females. So basically the idea, if you recall, how we proved genetic predisposition, is we took twins from alcoholic parents, took them out of their home, raised them in non-alcoholic homes, followed them, and how many of them became alcoholic being raised in a non-alcoholic home. Okay, so 20 years, so that was one study, and then another study that replicated the first study, so then we can say, okay, two different independent replications, we can say that it's fact. And they did that for both males and females. First study was replicated with males, and they said, oh, well, women drink too, why don't you run them both? Same time, no, we didn't do that. So Scandinavian twin study. So this is basically the gold standard for science. It's replicated. So then this is like empirically supported. We can say that it's fact. Empirically comes from the empire, that is the Roman Empire, which is the base, considered the base, one of the bases of Western civilization, right? So randomized controlled trials, meaning that you basically mix it up in terms of, by chance, you're not pre-selecting. People get selected into a control group and an experimental group, and then you basically report out the results. So, examples of empirically supported treatments or evidence-based treatment are multisystemic therapy, MST, cognitive behavioral therapy, parent-child interaction therapy, multidimensional therapeutic foster care, functional family therapy, and many others that you heard of and possibly used as industry standards in terms of the populations that we deal with. All right, as far as this goes. Now, one of the things that we look at in terms of, those practices was, were they done on the people that you're serving? And so, for example, one of the issues that I've often had, for example, with cognitive behavioral therapy, while it's nice in terms of looking at how people think, do all people think the same way, and do people think, basically, are they dealing with the same populations that have the same problems that you are facing? And are the way they think and their thought patterns captured within that particular framework? That is Western psychology. And does Western psychology fit for everyone? All right, so many of these ESTs and EBTs are found on reputable lists, such as the National Institutes of Health, so SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration, National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, Research Institutes, Matrix of Children's Evidence-Based Interventions, Hawaii Department of Health, etc. All those different particular places. So, evidence-based practices are often defined as the integration of best research evidence with clinical expertise and patient values, meaning that there is feedback from both clinicians and patients as to how effective they are. So, integration of the best available research with clinical expertise in the context of patient characteristics, culture, and preferences. That's like APA from 2005, and they're often associated with specific isolated conditions rather than types of multiple and comorbid. Comorbid means that they're occurring at the same time, and they're basically disease conditions. So comorbidity could also be basically like addiction and mental illness, as an example, that children and their families from diverse populations frequently experience. So comorbid conditions could also be they have an addiction and they're also poor, which is being poor is not a mental illness, but it is a condition that exacerbates other conditions in terms of poverty. So part of the issue that I have, and that's a commentary in the last bullet point, is basically white bread evidence. Now, I'm just using, when in the early discussions when people talk about culture and people think of culture as being limited to race, and you get a comment from white people saying, well, I'm just Heinz 57. I'm just white bread and mayonnaise. Like, I'm not sure why the food trope exactly, but the idea is, all right, so evidence-based practices basically study what the empire will fund. So therefore, if the government acknowledges it exists, universities acknowledge that it exists, and they can get money for it, they will study it. So they may or may not study your particular issue. So for a long time, we didn't have women's treatment because the industry was dominated by men. So they couldn't understand that, all right, women are experiencing sexual trauma that is causing them to self-medicate, and often if they're in abusive, domestically violent situations, they might want to seek treatment outside of that, which means they should bring their kids. And then you should provide treatment with their kids as a standard model. It took a long time for that to become a standard model. And I've been in the field long enough to remember when it wasn't a standard model. Someplace like, for example, a Willamette Family or Project Network didn't exist. So, the white bread evidence versus the habanero reality, where it's kind of spicy and kind of crunchy, and spicy at the same time. So, cultural adaptations of evidence-based practices are any modification to EST or EBT that involves changes in the approach to the delivery of the service, the nature of the therapeutic relationship, changes in the component of the intervention to accommodate cultural beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. So, for example, for a long time in terms of policy, the feds would only fund evidence-based practices so that we often had to make adaptations to those practices because they didn't reflect our reality. County government receives and has received and is receiving, and I'm part of the coalition, Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition, usually funded for broad spectrum efforts. This most recent iteration is funded to basically prevent alcoholism or alcohol abuse within a defined age range between 18 to 25 and younger, right? So some of you have seen the environmental survey. That's essentially where that came from. An empirically based survey focused on alcohol policy in various settings, and you do your environmental scan. A previous incarnation of the Prevention Coalition that I co-chaired and represented Lane on was basically looking at the Hawkins-Catalano. So David Hawkins, Richard Catalano, et al. Study based on risk, and it was risk-focused prevention. So Richard Catalano, Rico and David Hawkins. So Rico and Dave's model basically talked about risk factors, and the more risk factors you had, the more likely you would be to develop a substance abuse problem. And they several different ones, and you were basically funded by the feds to focus on reducing those risk factors within your particular community. They wanted you to engage youth, because youth were part of the target, right? And so they have also developed curriculum for various subgroups, like, for example, middle school, because, as an example, when I talked about the age of initiation in Oregon being 10, that's essentially school. So if you want to prevent first drug use in 10, you have to get them at 7 before they start, right? Now, one of the things that they noticed is that there is an effect size, that is, you give them regular doses of this curriculum and it's supposed to have an effect. Well, the most powerful substance abuse prevention curriculum only have an effect size of basically 18 to 24 months, a year and a half to 2 years after you administrate them, right? And that's the most effective ones. Things like DARE, okay, which is not empirically based at all, because, you know, if you think about it, common sense, this is my political commentary. Police officers, particularly the LAPD, are not drug counselors, right? If you want to have an officer-friendly program, do that. But don't do that at substance abuse prevention, because when they finally got around to studying DARE, which is not empirically based, ironically, they found that kids started using immediately after DARE graduation. So yeah, they might be not using while they're in the program, but as soon as they're out of the program, they're using. So it's pretty much useless. Doesn't even meet the 18 to 24. It's useless. But still, DARE was getting more than, you know, empirically based drug abuse prevention that scientifically showed you do this, it works. Well, why? Well, politically, it's easier, you know, police officer, you know, you can't be anti-crime, right? You can't, you know, be anti-police. So that's why we would often say, are we doing officer-friendly or are we doing drug prevention? So, Hawkins and Catalano. In Eugene, we had engaged a group of youth in high school, and one of the things that they had said is that their focus was they wanted, looking at this community, they wanted to deal with reducing racism. They saw that racism was a risk factor for substance abuse. That's what they wanted to focus on. But racism wasn't in this model explicitly. It was buried in the data. So, this was coming from white kids. All right, white kids want to work on racism. I'm going, sweet, okay. How do we do this? How do we engage them? Because their thing was looking at, okay, we need this to be a more open and friendly environment. How do we do this? So we looked at risk factor number 16, I believe the number was 16, which was alienation, rebelliousness, and lack of social bonding. Now, to name it that means that the researcher is coming from a particular point of view. And what this study is, it's a meta-study. So it's a study of many more studies that is distilling all these findings into one inclusive model. And so when we looked at the research behind this finding, all the studies that they cited, one of the things that we found in terms of applying this to racism was this. So remember the National Household Survey data and the Monitoring the Future data that I talked about. So remember, the survey was in the Ronald Reagan years, 80% of the illegal drug users are white men who make in excess of $50,000, that study, right? So Monitoring the Future, which basically studies K-12, MTF, K-12, found this, that minority youth in school use drugs less than white youth. Basically, is reflecting the National Household Study model. Well, basically that most of the drug users are white people, and then minorities are a minority of the drug users. And this was also found, so the numbers in this particular study basically said it was white youth were the biggest drug users, this is K through 12, in school. So not all youth are in school, some youth drop out, right? But the ones who are in schools and the ones that have studies where they look at ethnicity as a factor, so white youth, then Native American youth in two drug categories, inhalants and alcohol, then Hispanic, big jump, and black, then Asian.
Question.
Yes, go ahead.
So is that like relative to the percentage of those ethnicities?
Excellent question. So the data is adjusted to their size in the population,
Okay.
and within their population both, right? And then generalized to the national.
So it'd be like 50% of the white kids
Right.
that are there, and
Right.
then like maybe 30% of
Right.
the
And these are kids all in school too, right? So it's not looking at homeless kids, it's not looking at gang-related youth, it's not looking at, they're in school taking this survey. And so they adjust for population inside as part of the study too, relatively speaking, asking them the same questions as in the household survey for adults. All right? So this found, and so the worldview of this statement, alienation, rebelliousness, lack of social bonding. So if you, from my point of view, and reading the research, basically what it's basically saying is that there might be a reason that you're alienated from society. There might be a reason that you're rebelling against society and that you have a lack of social bonding from society. If society is rejecting you, shouldn't you rebel against that? But it's basically, the worldview is saying that society is normal and you should be conforming to it, which is a value within school. So some people will rebel by using drugs. They will. I mean, I did. The whole 60s thing was about rebelling against the values of society. Right? So here's what they found, though. For minority youth in school, they're already using drugs less than their white counterparts. The longer they remain in school, the more likely their use is to go up. Still below the white youth, but the longer they remain in the school system, the more their use goes up. And you'll also see some peaks at peak transition years like middle school, high school, along with everyone else. Now, one of the things that happened is that, so the risk factor then, if you're going to prevent drug use in minority youth, then you basically have to have them begin to conform to non-using drug, culturally specific peer values that wasn't specifically mentioned in the research. All right? So the research doesn't talk about racism, but The reason that we applied it to racism is because I witnessed what I refer to as the two Daves comment that was at two separate drug prevention events. The then Attorney General for the state of Oregon, and then 6 months later, David Hawkins, basically used the same joke, and they said, when I was in high school, the only people who used drugs were jazz musicians and people south of the border. So white people in the crowd laughed, the people of color in the go, oh, he didn't say that. Jazz musicians, people south of the border, please. In Medford, Frohnmeyer, please. No, we're not buying that. Hawkins said that in Seattle. So, in the question and answer, a Latino gentleman stood up and asked Hawkins directly, where is racism in your risk factor framework? And he kind of hemmed and hawed, and he said, alienation, rebelliousness, and social bonding. Okay, fine. I'll take that and run with it. The white youth in Eugene want to deal with racism. Hawkins says, number 16, cool, we'll run with that. So what's your guys' solution? Let's create a multicultural teen center down in the mall. We'll call it Mosaic. We'll have the YMCA be the fiscal agent. We'll throw some money in it, and then we'll have a place that all of us can come, and that will reduce our risk factors. We'll have the kids who are non-drug using peers mixed with homeless youth and runaway youth, and boom, 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 boom. Unfortunately, the YMCA is not a social service agency, so people didn't necessarily prepare for the fact that, oh, well, the kids who are not homeless are not necessarily going to be social service agents to the kids that are homeless. It became a hangout for homeless kids, which was yet another problem the YMCA is not positioned to deal with, right? So that's simply a problem in implementation. But where this fits in then, if you were going to do a cultural adaptation of this evidence-based process, then doing minority clubs that basically talk about and reinforce cultural protective factors, which is outside of this framework. Okay, so one of the things that it noticed is that minority youth in school, their use went up, but what kept their use down is basically creating a positive ethnic minority identity that was non-drug using by using basically history, specific role models, et cetera, and having that in the curriculum. And here's an interesting thing that once you get to the higher ed, so HBCUs is historically black colleges and universities. So these are created in segregation because at the time of the Civil War, after the Civil War, when these were founded, basically blacks were now newly freed slaves who wanted education. So historically, black colleges, universities were at the time black only, but eventually integrated in the 20th century. So here's one of the things that we found. Tracking on binge drinking as an indicator in college. So from high school to college, to freshman year in college, the binge drinking rates could jump from 28% to 35%. Freshman year in college, by following the data. At HBCUs, not only did the minority, so historically black colleges and universities, so not only did the cultural protective factor hold into college, where minority youth are already binge drinking less than their white peers in mainstream schools, and that holds true for historically black colleges and universities, but white youth going to historically black colleges and universities also binge drink less than their white peers, like at Harvard. And so when I'm in a crowd at this federal meeting in '94, and I said, that's very interesting. How do you account for that? And how long have you found that to be true? Well, they said, like the monitoring the future, study. Oh, well, we found that to be consistent for 16 years. 16 years? How come you never reported it till now? Seems like you could report that after 2 or 3. But straight years? Because that's not what's being reported in the media. According to the media, the drug users are black people. And if your data is showing otherwise, you could have gotten this out sooner, and we could have applied corrective actions. Because look at what's happening at HBCUs. What's happening at HBCUs that isn't happening at Harvard? Well, what's happening there is there's a sense of mission. We're not preparing for just a successful career. You're being prepared to be a cultural change agent, a role model, etc., right? And so even the white youth going to those schools are also using alcohol and other drugs, or tracking binge drinking less. So there's some kind of cultural effect that's lowering substance use. So when we talk about then cultural adaptations of evidence practices, the idea is, okay, the evidence-based people are missing part of the equation, but we're being funded to do evidence-based stuff. So what we're going to have to do is adapt it to our specific people, including the white people that they seem to be missing in terms of their focus. So the adaptations must not just tweak the evidence-based practice, but must fundamentally adapt it to reflect the cultural worldview of the individual, including values, traditions, beliefs, and practices, and spiritual perspectives. So, for example, the Indian Country Child Trauma Center has done exactly that with 5 evidence-supported treatments and evidence-based practices within their particular framework. And also out of Indian Country, you have the phrase talking about cultural competency, which Terry Cross's model, PSU, was basically an adaptation to looking at the Indian Child Welfare Act and looking at historical trauma as a factor within substance abuse and other related problems. All right, so practice-based evidence has been defined as a range of treatment approaches and supports that are derived from and supportive of the positive cultural aspects of the local society and tradition. So PBEs are accepted as effective by the local community through community consensus and address the therapeutic and healing needs of individuals and families from a culturally specific framework. So, for example, there is a book called, well, several books by this cat named Edward Rand. So Duran is Native American, but he's a clinical psychologist. So he's a PhD. Western-trained clinical psychologist who was practicing in New Mexico in Native communities, and basically was finding that his Western didn't necessarily meet the worldview of the natives he was treating. And so he was actually advised to go seek out this old native gentleman who had met Carl Jung. And basically he wrote his first book, which I recommend if you're going to look at his work, that you follow a particular sequence. It's called Buddha in Red Face. And then Healing the Soul Wound. And then Native American Post-Colonial Psychology. So in Buddha and Red Face, he basically talks about his particular journey, how he started getting to the point of being able to write books like Healing the Soul Wound in Native American Post-Colonial Psychology. And he mentions certain frameworks within Healing the Soul Wound, basically particularly dealing with veterans and PTSD, but also introducing the concept of medicine. So medicine in Indian country is not just the substance, though it might be. It's also the energy. And that the substance itself has a consciousness and a history. So that if you're doing a particular drug, you're not just doing the drug, that dose, you're also taking into yourself the entire history of that drug and everything that's been done with it. And if you don't give reference to that history, the drug itself takes a piece of it, a piece of you, if you don't acknowledge it. So for example, with meth, since meth has been used in war and rape and child abuse, you don't acknowledge that that history is in it, it takes your teeth, it takes your bones. Now, sure, in Western science, we can physiologically explain why meth does that, right? But this gives a different perspective if you want to go on the other end in terms of looking at recovery. Every time I'm tempted to do this, this is what I'm doing. If I add this consciousness to my sheaf of protective factors around me, will I stay cleaner longer? Particularly if my cultural framework supports that. Or what if I don't have a cultural framework? Could adopting this cultural framework help me? Duran finds it does, right? To use that outside, basically as part of native science, as it were, and adapting that to a more general population. So he explains that a little bit more in Native American post-colonial psychology.